Barely Got Here is a collection of stories and conversations based on 24 years in law enforcement. You have the right to be disturbed by some of the content or disagree with the viewpoints. Anything you hear can and will be dosed with sarcasm and dark humor. You have the right to know the discussions will often be graphic with language and themes that are intended for a mature audience. Do you understand your rights? Then buckle up, Buttercup. We're going 10-8. Hello and welcome back to I Barely Got Here. I'm your host, Kevin Booncher. This is episode number 4. You're not a cop, right? I was working in Special Investigations Bureau as a detective and had been there for a few years. Some contact information was forwarded to us about a guy who wanted to provide us with information on a couple of guys stealing street bikes, motorcycles. The man wanted to stay anonymous and was only willing to provide a phone number intro for a detective. So when someone wants to provide information to the police anonymously, it can come in a number of ways. A phone call, email, letter. Someone could get it on the street, be dropped off at a station lobby or a website. The information is then passed on to the appropriate bureau or unit. So drug info would go to narcs, robbery info would go to the robbery dicks, and so on. And if there's a callback number given, someone will call and try to get as much info as possible. And the information is simply that, it's information. It hasn't been corroborated, and it can't be considered reliable in the eyes of the legal system. We as a police can't take that info, write a search warrant, and kick in someone's door looking for evidence of a crime. This could be a good citizen who has some information about someone selling drugs in their neighborhood and they're just afraid of retribution, or sometimes it's simply just one drug dealer trying to eliminate his drug dealing competition. A person providing information in this fashion is rarely compensated, and we as the police do all that we can to minimize their exposure and involvement, which is called walling them off. So this means that we need to develop our own information, our own probable cause during the investigation, so that the only thing that goes into reports and is listed in any of the legal paperwork are our own investigative efforts, which also minimizes the chances that we'll have to divulge the source of information during a court proceeding or anything else. These sources of information are referred to as confidential sources, or CSs. Then there's a next step, a confidential informant, or a CI. And this takes everything to a higher level and is much more complicated. And I'll get into the details of working a CI in a later episode, I'm sure, but suffice it to say that those are never easy. They get complicated if they go on very long at all, and they always walk a fine line between what's legal and a gray area legal. I've never worked or supervised someone working a CI that was completely free of issues. So the info given was relayed to my squad sergeant, who assigned it to me for follow-up. Our unit and one other were responsible for follow-up on things like this. I made contact with the CS and got what I thought was really good info from him. This guy knew a guy who knew a guy that was stealing street motorcycles. So the plan was for this CS to give my number to that guy who knew the guy and explain that I might be interested in purchasing these bikes. And up to that point, according to the CS, these guys had no way to turn these motorcycles into money. So these thieves were probably like a lot. They had the misconception that there are chop shops on every corner that are just itching to give you way too much money for your stolen motorcycle or car, which just isn't the case. First, the market for stolen vehicles is cheap and it's not nearly as available as you would think. Buyers are few in number and they don't give very much for a stolen car or motorcycle unless you really get into kind of a rare, exclusive long-term relationship. But that's where we came in. After not very long, I was contacted by the friend of the guy who was stealing the motorcycles. He was interested, but he's very suspicious, as he should be. So for purposes of my story, I'm going to call this guy Doug, and the guy that was actually stealing these bikes, Mark. Making easy money makes people do dumb things. It makes someone open to entering into a criminal relationship with a perfect stranger, someone they'd never trust with anything of importance under normal circumstances. But that's how we catch nearly any crook where money's on the line. Greed. So in addition to some other questions, Doug comes around to asking me if I was a cop, as they all do. So let's talk about this question. In many criminal circles, there's the belief that if you ask an undercover cop if they are the cops, they're legally bound to tell you the truth. Yes, I am a cop. And as stupid as this sounds, this was, and probably still is, a belief among some of these people. And we're just fine with that. I and some of my guys and gals have had some pretty funny conversations with criminals on this exact topic, and we always make sure that we confirm and strengthen their belief that undercover cops have to tell the truth if asked the question. Oh, yeah, they have to tell you they're the cop if you ask them. That's the law. And some UCs will have a great story to reinforce this. Yeah, this friend of mine was slinging E over in Maryville, and he braced this new dude really hard and asked him if he was a cop. And on the story goes. So I reply to Doug, well, I'm not a cop. Are you a cop? Doug denies that he is, of course, and that's it. We're off and running. There's still suspicion on both sides, but as long as he's ready to meet, that's all I need at this point. My squad and I decided it'd be a great idea to use a self-storage facility in a more secluded area of town for a meet and purchase location. This will allow us to wire the unit, meaning set it up with audio and video recording devices to record all the transactions. And it'll be a good location in the event that there are any problems or issues while we're working the undercover operations. We make contact with the owner of the storage facility and explain things to him, and he gives permission to access the inner maintenance area so we can run cables and power and everything for the unit, and he also lets us use the unit for a month. We get some motorcycle parts and various tools and leave them laying around in the locker to give it just the right look. Now we just need to make a deal. The first deal of any undercover transaction is usually the most dangerous, whether it's dope or property or whatever. This is when both sides are feeling each other out, the suspicions are at their highest, and often it's the first time that both sides even see each other face to face. There were numerous times I'd meet with a crook for a first deal or a plan of crime, and the tension and the anxiety would just be twisting up your guts, but you had to maintain that real calm and cool exterior. And then when you're the boss, your anxiety hits the same levels every time one of your guys or gals has their first meets. If that first meet goes well and the suspect finds that they didn't get arrested either there or down the road, as is often the case, then things typically relax a little. And during a longer-term UC investigation, it can get where these criminals start to treat you as a friend. They invite you to parties and they try to get you to get high with them, and they want to introduce you to their friends. And if you're a female UC, they start to hit on them at some point. It's almost inevitable. Sometimes the meets and the deals after that first scary one are actually more challenging because you have to fight off some poor crook who just wants you as another friend. Or again, if you're a female UC, they have to deflect and argue off having sex with them as the bad guy spends more and more time around the UC. I speak with Doug again prior to our first meeting, and we discuss what I'll pay for the motorcycles. He says he needs a cut of the payment as the middleman and because he drives Mark to where he steals these bikes, and I agree, but I say, hey, that's up to you and him. I'll pay what I think it's worth for me to flip it, and then you guys will have to work it out from there. As I said, these guys always overvalue their stolen merchandise, so he starts too high on what he thinks that they'll want per motorcycle, and at some point I have to remind him that, hey, I'm not buying a clean bike with a clean title at some used car lot here. So buying and selling property, whether it's vehicles, motorcycles, tools, bicycles, or whatever, isn't like buying and selling dope. So with dope, the prices are somewhat established. The cost will fluctuate some, as anything will, based on quantity and location in the city, state, or country, but users and dealers know pretty close to what they'll need to pay for a given quantity of drugs before that first deal's made. And of course, the more you buy, the better the price. The property's different. So on my side, I have to balance trying to make a relationship and start buying stolen property from these folks without seeming too eager or agreeing to a deal that's too far out of whack, so to speak. Because if I do, it'll scream that I'm the cops and they'll be gone. The fastest way I've seen UC deals for property fall apart before they even start is when the UC agrees to pay a ridiculous price with no strings right off the bat. I mean, you have to play it like a real crook would. You got to argue, you got to scoff, complain, get offended, be like a normal guy. I can tell these guys are young and inexperienced with this sort of thing, so I decide that I'm going to be the guy who knows how things work. I want them to think that I've been buying and selling stolen cars and motorcycles for years, and I don't want to offend them or make them feel foolish. I want to try to guide them. I want to become their mentor and the guy who can help them make some money, and that plan works. We settle on a per-bike price for each motorcycle, and I explain that it'll be anywhere from around $200 to maybe $600 or more for a higher-valued motorcycle. And I'm not going to buy a piece of junk if they bring one of those to me. So here's another aspect of an investigation like this that gets sticky. So as a police, we can't create a market for stolen property, meaning we can't create a stolen motorcycle crime wave by soliciting someone to steal them so that we can buy them, and then we bust them. At least a conscientious cop or organization is never going to do that. And quite frankly, if an investigation did start that way, the defense attorneys would punch so many holes in it before it got very far, it would just end up being a huge waste of time. But in this case, we'd been contacted by someone who was already stealing them, so we weren't creating the problem, but we were going to stop it. I get a call that they have a motorcycle they just ripped and they want to sell. Okay. I get the make and model and general description. I say, yep, I'm interested. Now, this will be our first meeting with them, so everybody's nervous, including me. I really know nothing about them, and I don't even think we had them ID'd at that point, which isn't out of the ordinary. When I mentioned that I'd like to meet them at our storage facility, we're all kind of holding our breath because we don't know how they're going to take it. For undercover operations, the meet location is a very important aspect of any deal for a number of reasons. Law enforcement will always try to control the location, and there's nothing worse we hate than tripping, which means changing the meet location at the last minute. Luckily, they like the idea of my secluded meet location, so we're good to go. Time comes to meet them at our storage locker. A few guys from my squad and my squad sergeant get staged in the parking lot inside the place prior to the meet, sitting inside their UC cars. And they'll be monitoring the body bug that I'm wearing. And our verbal distress codes have been worked out and are known to all the cover detectives so they know when to come running if something goes wrong. One of the cool things about this whole investigation was deciding that I'd get to ride a bike myself to better sell the role. So luckily we'd seized and forfeited to the city a street bike from another investigation that was concluded. And this bike was almost the same as the personal bike that I had at the time. So I was real familiar with it. We'd already gone through the process to make it available for us to use as an undercover squad, so it was an easy call. I'd ride this bike back and forth from our UC location to the storage locker location to give things more authenticity. And it worked great. And how cool was it that I get to ride a crotch rocket around as part of my workday? You never know if a crook will try to conduct counter-surveillance on a meet location prior to meeting with us. If they're smart, they would, but I can only remember a couple of times we caught suspects checking out a meet location ahead of time. They're usually just not that smart. But because of that, we usually had to have our cover team guys inside way prior to the meet time, especially for first meets. And then I would get there ahead of time as well. You don't want the bad guys waiting for you. So I ride my UC motorcycle to our storage locker place, punch in the code, and I get into our locker location. All my squad guys are set up, and one guy had punched record on the AV equipment, so we were good to go on that end. And remember I spoke about controlling the meet location. Another great aspect of this storage locker business was that we controlled just when we let these guys in. So for our first meeting, and the following meetings, they'd let me know when they're at the gate, and then I'd go let them in when I was ready. So that way there'd be no surprises, unless they could get out and walk in on foot, but that never did happen. So Doug is driving an older Chevy Blazer and came with Mark for each of these motorcycle buys. I drove my bike out to the gate and let them both in. Both are nervous and looking around the entire time. As I lead them to the storage locker, I see them looking around at all the parked cars and RVs in the lot, and I just hope that they don't see one of my cover team guys. This meet was after dark, which helps with hiding those guys, though, as well. I always preferred the nighttime meets, and to be honest with you, I always preferred nighttime work, period. We get back to my locker, and I park and lift the door open, and Doug and Mark park nearby, and they both hesitate to get out or off, still kind of watching intently for any indication of some sort of problem or that cops are going to come flying out of everywhere. I get them to come over to the locker, and within a few minutes, things are calmed down and going well. They're both younger kids and kind of look like what I had anticipated. Doug is more clean-cut, looks kind of like a college kid, and he's fairly normal. Mark is a little edgier. He's got a Mohawk-style haircut, and he's obviously the thief of this duo. And I make the correct assessment that if either one of them are going to be armed, it's definitely Mark. There's not a lot of small talk on this first deal, and things are tense, and we're all filling each other out. I check out the bike and give it a quick test ride in the lot and come back. Well, later on, while reviewing the tape, we see that these two started checking out the inside of that storage locker hard, looking for any signs of surveillance equipment while I was out on that test ride. And thankfully, we had things set up really well, and since they didn't find anything, it just helped to further validate us. We'd already discussed a tentative offer, and that's what I give to Mark, $200 or $300. I always ask where they got it from for our investigative purposes so we can trace it back to the victim and the jurisdiction. But what I tell them is so that I can avoid that area so I don't get busted. So they tell me where they stole it from. During that short time and the following deals, I'm always trying to work these guys closer to the cameras and the mics that we have in the locker for documentation in the investigation. And during any investigation, there's nothing better than audio and video of crooks that are committing crimes or talking about committing their crimes. I roll the hot bike into my locker, and Mark gets into Doug's Blazer, and I start to roll the storage door down. I tell them to just head back toward the gate and they'll hit the pad in the asphalt and it'll open automatically. And that pretty much finishes our first deal. It went without a hitch. We give it some time, and one of the cover guys follows Mark and Doug away from the location a few miles just to make sure that they're out of the area. I lock things up, shut down the AV equipment, pull the tape, and drive the hot bike that we just balked back to our office for follow-up. I get one of the guys to drive me back later to get my UC bike back to the office. We find that the motorcycle is listed as stolen, and it wasn't stolen very long ago, so we start the process of recovering a stolen vehicle. The issue is we want to keep from returning it to the owner as long as we can, because if it's returned right away, and Doug or Mark happen to see it out, it's just going to scream that I'm a cop, and that might shut everything down. So my boss gives me a week and tells me just leave it parked in the UC office warehouse and then we'll do the recovery. But within less than a week, Doug calls and says they have another one. Things work the same way. We meet. They're a lot calmer and relaxed. We BS a little bit. The AV is recording all their statements, how they're taking them, where they're taking them from, on. And I just let them go on and on. The sale's made and they're on their way. Another aspect that we have to monitor the entire time is how they're stealing these bikes. So far, it's just been like an ignition punch out and run. No carjack, no robbery, no threats or violence or anything like that, which is good, or we'd have an issue with letting things go and raise the stakes of someone possibly getting hurt. So now we're at 2 stolen motorcycles purchased, we have them identified, and things are progressing really well. To establish a trafficking charge, whether it's dope or property, the county attorney typically wants to see 3 transactions, 3 and out. 4 or 5 is better, but you aren't doing much good going past that unless it's an attempt to reach into a higher level of a criminal organization. And these 2 knuckleheads weren't part of any larger conspiracy. And once you hit those 3 or 4 deals, you aren't going to get any stiffer trafficking charge by going to 10. It's just overkill. And if you're the citizens, you don't want to allow the theft of your property to continue for no reason. So we had decided that we were going to do 5 deals because they were a couple of deals that we had some AV issues or we just didn't get the statements that we wanted. Deal 3 rolls around. The third bike is the best one of this investigation. It's a new model, limited release Honda that was a beautiful machine. And Mark had seen it while driving around and knew it would be something I'd give good money for, so they ripped it. I remember we paid about $600 for that one. By this time, I'd released the first bike back to the owner, and they were happy to get it back. I explained what had happened, and they thought it was really cool, and it'd be a great story to tell, but I asked them to hold off on storytelling for another couple of weeks, just never know who knows who, and they were totally cool with that. So since we had to return the bike, we also took an opportunity to turn this to our advantage as much as we could. During the third bike purchase, I brought up that I'd been moving the first bike to another place, and the cops tried to stop me. I spun this great tale of flying through traffic and lights and sirens everywhere, blah, 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 as I ran from the cops and that I had to dump it and run. Doug and Mark bought it completely, and it helped with my credibility as a cop-hating crook just like them. So now we're covered if they just happen to see it out and about. We had suspected that Mark was coming to our meetings armed with a handgun in his waistband. I can't blame them, and they might have even seen mine. It just makes sense if you're a crook. But it's not something to take lightly, even if they're my pals by now. We decide I'll broach the issue and see what Mark says. After our deal's done and they have the money in their pockets and they're happy, I bring up the subject and ask if he carries a gun. Mark's completely open. He says, yeah. Before I can go much further, he changes the dynamic of my investigation and says, yeah, if anybody ever gives me shit, I'll just stick this in their face and take off. Damn. I know that my investigation will be closing down sooner than planned now. So when Mark makes a statement like that he'd use a firearm during the commission of a theft, it puts us on notice. If during the next theft he ends up threatening or shooting or, God forbid, killing somebody, we'll wear some of that since he essentially told us that's what would happen if he was confronted. In the back of my mind, I'm thinking, oh, that's something we'll talk about at the office later. So as for this third bike, I admit that I kind of took the long way back to the office as it was just such a nice ride and the air was clean and cool, and it just gave me some time to think about things. Well, when I got back, as expected, my boss and I talk, and we agree that we're going to have to shut things down earlier than planned. We set up a meeting with the county attorney who was going to prosecute the case for us. So when there's a lengthy or complicated investigation, things always go more smoothly post-arrest if you establish who your prosecutor is going to be and you update them on things as they unfold. And they always appreciate being involved as well. We meet with our prosecutor and lay out the latest events, and he's in agreement. We have to close it down soon. We plan to let them contact us for a fourth buy and just pray that Mark doesn't get stupid and shoot somebody. And it's not long before I hear from Doug, and there's no mention of a shootout, and I didn't see anything, and that's a big relief. Another part of the plan was to take these guys down at the next meeting. We put together a good plan and got help from our sister squad for that night. Doug and I agree to meet the next day at our storage facility as usual. I meet them at the gate and let them in, and we all drive back to my locker, and as we're driving, I'm hoping they don't notice all the new cars parked in and around the facility who are my arrest and cover teams. We get back there, and after some small talk, make the deal for this fourth bike. They don't have a care in the world. They don't know that their lives as they know them are about to come to an abrupt end. And I do know what's going to happen, so I'm trying to control my anxiety and nervousness and stay cool. All the cover and arrest guys are listening to the body bug, so they'll know when I give the bus signal, which is the signal for them to come running up and arrest everybody. The plan we'd come up with involved my getting a hold of Mark's handgun prior to the arrest, which my sergeant was none too cool with at first. I just knew that Mark was unpredictable, and I really didn't want my guys to have to shoot him, or for me to have to shoot him for that matter, if things started or when things started to happen. I felt that he was a guy who could panic, and there's a good chance he may make a grab for that gun, and I really wanted to avoid that for all our sakes. So my boss goes with it, and then he asked me, well, how are you going to get it? I'll ask him. So once we had done our deal, but before I rolled the hot bike into the locker, I asked Mark if he had that gun on him. And he did, and I explained that I was thinking about getting one myself and asked him how much he liked it. Well, he reaches behind his back and pulls out this black handgun. So my anxiety shoots to the roof, and I'm touching the grip of my own handgun behind my back. But once I see that he's not going to do anything stupid, this gives me the excuse I need to drop both of them into the storage locker so that they'll be out of the view of the main driveway and hopefully unable to see my buddies approaching here pretty soon. So I say, come in here with that, so, just in case someone's around. So they both step in, and Mark shows it to me and says he really likes it and kind of gives me a crook's version of a sales pitch. So I ask him if I can see it and check it out. No problem. He hands it over, and I start looking at it. So I'm feeling much better now. The gun's in my hands, in my control, and it's almost a sure bet that Doug isn't carrying anything based on my time and contacts with him over the investigation. I pull the mag and check the chamber, which is empty, and try to act like I don't know much about what I'm doing. As they're both watching me, and I have them facing toward the back of the locker, I clearly say, "Did you hear that?" And my stomach grumbling. Well, that was our bus signal. So the plan was for me to get possession of that handgun, and then I'd give that bus signal, which is supposed to bring my guys in from all the hidden locations all over to arrest us. And it's at that moment of a UC operation that your adrenaline's pumping and you're just waiting and hoping that they heard you and they're on the way. There's some really funny and scary moments when there's a delay between the UC giving the bus signal and the arrest team, whether they're going to make it or not. In a matter of seconds, I hear yelling, "Get your hands up, don't move," all the things that are just music to my ears. And it still startles even me. Well, it really scared these two. We saw Doug peeing his pants basically as things were unfolding inside that storage locker. The plan was to arrest me with them so that we could use it to our advantage during the interviews for Mark and Doug. So we're ordered down to our knees, and I make sure to put the gun far out in front of me so it's out of Mark's reach as well. One of my squad guys makes it a point to rough me up a little bit as he's cuffing me, much to everybody's amusement. There's a number of reasons to get arrested with the suspects. It can be used later during interviews. There's nothing as funny as watching a suspect react when the UC walks into their interview with the badge around his neck, especially after they just pinned every aspect of the crimes on that guy. Or it can be used to shield the UC for future work. Since most investigations and prosecution are resolved prior to going to trial, we can keep the UC unidentified for other investigations. Mark and Doug both gave it up completely, explained their crimes, and admitted to all of it. They thought I was just some thug that they were introduced to, and they were actually more afraid of me ripping them off than the other way around. They weren't masterminds or psychopaths, just a couple of young, dumb guys who thought it was fun stealing motorcycles and then getting a couple bucks for them. They both reached a plea agreement with the prosecutor that was fair, and we concluded a fantastic case without anybody getting shot. That's a win-win. And with that, I close another episode of I Barely Got Here. Thank you for listening, and please check back for new episodes. If you have a question or a comment, please let me know via email, ibarelyGotHere@gmail.com, social media, or our webpage, and I'll do my best to address it. Sam42 is 10-7.